There is a particular kind of silence that follows a wound so deep that the body does not yet know how to bleed. Evangeline Ashworth knew that silence well. She had stood in the blue drawing-room of Wyndham House on a grey November afternoon. Dressed in her finest gown, the ivory one with the mended hem she prayed no one would notice, and she had heard the Duke of Wyndham look her over with eyes as cold and flat as winter slate and say, without a flicker of remorse, "I find I cannot proceed. Marry my brother instead." 7 words. 7 words that unmade 2 years of hope, of careful letters, of her father's quiet negotiations, of her own private, foolish imaginings. And she had agreed. Not because she was weak. Not because she had no voice. But because Evangeline Ashworth had been poor long enough to understand that survival sometimes wears the face of surrender. And that the most dangerous thing a woman could do in that drawing-room was weep. She did not weep. She curtsied. She said, "As you wish, Your Grace." She accepted the hand of Lord Edmund Wyndham, second son, charming, directionless, and utterly indifferent to her, and she walked out of that room with her spine straight and her hands perfectly still. What the Duke did not know, what he could not have predicted as he watched her go with those cold, satisfied eyes, was that by the time the sun rose the following morning, he would already have begun to understand the magnitude of his mistake. And that understanding would cost him everything. The arrangement had begun, as most arrangements did in the Regency world, with money. Or rather, with the absence of it. Sir Gerald Ashworth had once possessed a modest fortune, 300 acres in Wiltshire, and the sort of quiet respectability that passed without remark at county assemblies. But Sir Gerald had also possessed a fondness for cards and a stubborn faith that his luck would change, and by the autumn of Evangeline's 23rd year, what remained of the Ashworth estate was a draughty house, a handful of loyal servants who had not been properly paid in months, and a daughter of extraordinary capability whom no one in London seemed to notice. The Duke of Wyndham's interest, or what had been presented as his interest, had arrived through the offices of a mutual acquaintance. A solicitor named Partridge who trafficked in the quiet currency of desperate families and noble houses in need of respectability injected from the outside. The Wyndham dukedom was ancient, powerful, and solvent. The current Duke, Gideon Wyndham, was 31, unmarried, and possessed of a reputation so formidable that the matchmaking mothers of London whispered his name like a weather warning. He was not cruel, they said. But he was exacting. He did not suffer softness. He had returned from the Peninsula campaigns with something removed from him that no amount of social polish had replaced, and what remained was a man made entirely of duty, efficiency, and a composure so complete it bordered on devastation. Evangeline had prepared herself accordingly. She had studied. She had read parliamentary proceedings, agricultural reports, estate ledgers. She had prepared to be a useful wife rather than a decorative one, because useful was the only thing she knew how to be, and she had hoped, quietly, privately hoped, that a man of intelligence might eventually value that. She had not prepared for the drawing-room. She had not prepared for the way Gideon Wyndham had looked at her, not with contempt exactly, but with a kind of clinical disappointment. As though she were an entry in a ledger that failed to balance. He had stood by the window in his dark coat, impossibly composed, and she had watched him decide against her in the space of 30 seconds. She had seen it cross his face before he spoke. The words that followed were almost secondary. "Marry my brother instead." Edmund had been present. He had the grace to look briefly embarrassed, running a hand through his fair hair, before arranging his expression into something more accommodating. He was handsome in the easy, uncomplicated way of men who have never had to try very hard, and he had smiled at her with genuine warmth, which was either a kindness or an insult depending on how one chose to interpret it. "I think we shall suit very well, Miss Ashworth," Edmund had said. And because Evangeline was practical above all other things, she had decided to believe him. The wedding was quiet. It took place 6 weeks later in the small chapel at Wyndham's secondary property, Ashcroft Hall, a sprawling, half-neglected estate in the Derbyshire hills that had not seen a mistress in 11 years. This was Edmund's domain, such as it was. A property with 3 working fireplaces out of 14, a kitchen that flooded in heavy rain, tenants who had not received proper attention in years, and a staff of 9 who ranged from fiercely devoted to quietly despairing. Gideon Wyndham attended the wedding as required by courtesy. He stood at the back of the chapel in his grey coat and said nothing. And when the ceremony was concluded, he congratulated Edmund with a handshake and offered Evangeline a bow so precise and so empty of warmth that it functioned as its own kind of dismissal. She had already decided not to be dismissed. Ashcroft Hall in winter was a study in beautiful neglect. The stone facade was magnificent, all Elizabethan grandeur and sprawling symmetry, but the interior told a different story, peeling plasterwork in the upper galleries. Windows that let the Derbyshire wind slice through as freely as though the glass were merely a suggestion, a still room that smelled of mold and abandoned purpose, and a cook named Mrs. Perry who had kept the household alive on sheer stubbornness and not much else. Edmund departed for London 3 days after the wedding. He was cheerful about it, which was, Evangeline came to understand, his characteristic response to most situations, including inconvenient ones. He kissed her hand at the door with genuine affection, promised to return by Christmas, and disappeared into the grey morning in a carriage that took the last of the warmth with it. She stood at the window and watched the road until it was empty. Then she asked Mrs. Perry to show her the account books. The housekeeper, a stout woman of 60 with red-knuckled hands and suspicious eyes, had stared at her for a long moment before complying. Evangeline suspected the woman had expected tears, or complaints, or an immediate demand to redecorate the parlor. What she had not expected was a new bride sitting down at the water-stained library table in her second-best wool dress, opening a ledger that was 3 years out of date, and beginning to read. Evangeline read for 4 hours. She made a list. The list was not encouraging. The tenant farms, 7 in total, were operating at less than half capacity. 2 roofs needed immediate repair before the heavy winter rains arrived. The kitchen garden had been abandoned and what food came into the house was purchased at considerable expense from the village market. The household staff had been reduced year by year through attrition and unpaid wages, and those who remained did so out of attachment to the hall and nowhere else to go. And Edmund's allowance from the dukedom, the modest stipend Gideon administered with characteristic precision, was enough to maintain the house at its current level of pleasant deterioration. But nothing more. She asked to walk the grounds the following morning. She walked every inch of them, in her heaviest cloak, mud climbing to her ankles, a small notebook pressed against her ribs. She spoke to the remaining tenant farmers. 3 of whom were elderly and 1 of whom was a widow with 4 children who had been quietly managing her own land with no support from the hall for 2 years. She walked through the walled kitchen garden, half buried in dead bramble, and stood in its center for a long moment, looking at the structure of it, the old espalier frames. The original planting beds still sound beneath the neglect, the south-facing wall that caught the light even on a gray December morning. It could be recovered. Most of it could be recovered. She returned to the hall with mud on her boots and a plan forming in the back of her mind, and she found Mrs. Perry in the kitchen, and she said, "I should like to start with the garden, if you are willing to help me." Mrs. Perry looked at the mud on the new mistress's boots, and something shifted in the older woman's eyes. Not trust, not yet. But recognition. "There's a boy from the village, Mrs. Perry said carefully, who helped old Mr. Colton before he passed. He's strong and he works for fair wages. Send for him," Evangeline said. "And tell me who else in the village might be glad of work." Winter gave way to something that could not quite be called spring but that possessed, at least, the ambition of it. By February, 2 of the 7 tenant farms had been brought into productive discussion. Evangeline had sat with the farmers at their own kitchen tables, reviewed their individual circumstances with the account books open between them, and renegotiated fair arrangements that asked something of both parties. She had written 3 letters to Edmund in London regarding necessary repairs, each letter more specific than the last, each accompanied by a detailed cost estimate she had assembled herself. The 3rd letter produced results. Edmund, with the good-natured carelessness of a man who did not enjoy being made to feel guilty, had spoken to the family solicitor. And 2 months of funds had arrived. She used every shilling. The kitchen garden returned first. By April it was producing, not abundantly, but steadily, early lettuces and kitchen herbs, the beginnings of the vegetable beds. The promise of summer fruit from the espalier pears she had carefully pruned back. Mrs. Perry had stopped watching Evangeline with suspicious eyes and had begun watching her with something closer to fierce pride, as though the garden's recovery were a personal vindication. The widow, Mrs. Crane, had become something of a household fixture. She arrived 3 mornings a week with her eldest daughter to help with the heavier mending and the dairy work. And her presence had drawn 2 other women from the village who had skills the hall desperately needed. The still room was reopened, cleaned, and put to use. Dried lavender hung from the ceiling of the upper gallery. The smell of mold receded. Evangeline had opened the locked east wing. The servants had spoken about it in lowered voices since her arrival, 11 rooms sealed since the death of the old duke's wife, Edmund and Gideon's mother, who had died at Ashcroft in the winter of their childhood. No one had entered since. The lock was stiff but not damaged, and when Evangeline pressed the door open on a windy March afternoon, what she found was not the expected darkness of grief and dust, but a series of rooms that, beneath their gray holland covers, contained some of the most beautiful furniture she had ever seen. She did not touch it immediately. She stood in the doorway of what had been the mistress's sitting room and let the silence inform her. There was a small watercolor on the wall above the fireplace, a woman with dark eyes and 2 young boys on a summer lawn. The kind of happiness so direct and unguarded that looking at it felt almost like trespassing. She closed the door and went to write another letter. This one was not to Edmund. It was to the Duke of Windham. She informed him, in precise and unemotional language, that the East Wing at Ashcroft required a decision regarding its maintenance and the disposition of the furniture and personal effects within it. That she had not presumed to act without his instruction on a matter that she understood to be of personal significance, and that she would await his guidance. She did not expect a reply. She received one in 11 days. It said only, "You may act as you see fit." She read it 3 times. She folded it. She placed it in the small rosewood box on her writing desk where she kept the few things she considered worth keeping. Then she went to open the East Wing properly, and she began, room by room, to let Ashcroft Hall breathe again. Gideon Windham arrived at Ashcroft Hall on a Tuesday in late June without prior notice. He had intended to come in spring, then delayed for the parliamentary session, then for an estate matter in Somerset, then for reasons he did not examine too closely. He had told himself that the delay was practical. He had not told himself what he had been thinking about in the quiet hours of his London study when Partridge had mentioned, with studied casualness, that Mrs. Edmund Windham, rather, had managed to bring the Ashcroft tenant rolls into positive accounts for the first time in 6 years. He rode in through the Ashcroft gates at 4 in the afternoon, and the first thing he noticed was that the gate itself had been rehung. It had dragged on its hinges for as long as he could remember, scraping the gravel with a sound he associated with the particular misery of childhood visits. Now it swung clean and quiet, and the lane beyond it had been raked. And the overgrown yew hedges on either side had been cut back so that the hall's stone face was visible from the gate for the first time in years. He pulled his horse to a walk without thinking. The kitchen garden was visible over the south wall as he passed, green, ordered, obviously tended. There were linen sheets on the line in the side yard, white in the afternoon light. A boy he did not recognize was carrying water from the well with the competent indifference of established routine. He dismounted in the yard and the groom who came to take his horse was young but sure-handed, and murmured a proper greeting. Inside the hall, the entrance was warm in the way it had not been in his memory, lit by afternoon light through windows that had been cleaned, the stone floor swept. A bowl of garden lavender on the hall table filling the air with something domestic and alive. He stood in the entrance hall and waited, and in the silence he heard, from somewhere in the East Wing, where nothing had been heard in 20 years, a woman's voice reading aloud. He followed the sound. In his mother's old sitting room, the holland covers had been removed, the furniture restored to its original arrangement, the fireplace swept clean and laid with fresh wood. Seated in the window chair was a child, a small girl of perhaps 6 or 7 whom he did not recognize, and in the chair opposite, reading from a small blue book in a clear, unhurried voice, was a woman in a plain gray dress whose dark hair had come partly loose from its pins. She looked up when she heard his step in the doorway. There was a beat of silence in which Gideon Windham experienced something he could not immediately name. It was not quite recognition, although he knew her face. It was not quite surprise, although he had not expected this room to look like this, to feel like this, to be alive. It was something closer to the disorientation of returning to a place you left behind and finding it transformed into something better than you deserved to come back to. Evangeline set down her book and rose with composure. "Your Grace," she said. Not warmly. Not coldly. With the precise courtesy of a woman who had decided what she owed him and nothing more. "Mrs. Windham," he said. We were not expecting you. I should have written. Yes, she said. Simply, without apology for saying it. You should have. The child, who had been watching with wide eyes, slipped down from her chair and pressed herself against Evangeline's skirt with the easy trust of long acquaintance. Evangeline's hand came to rest on the child's head without thought, the gesture so natural and unselfconscious that Gideon found he could not look away from it. This is Lily, Evangeline said. Mrs. Crane's youngest. She comes with her mother on mending days. I hope you have no objection. He did not. He found he had no objection to anything he had seen so far, which was itself deeply disorienting. Where is Edmund? He asked. London, Evangeline said. As he generally is. She said it without bitterness, which was worse, somehow, than bitterness would have been. Dinner that evening was a quiet, carefully managed exercise in civilized tension. Mrs. Perry had produced a meal that reflected Ashcroft's new circumstances rather than its old embarrassments, not lavish, but genuinely good. With vegetables from the kitchen garden and a sauce that suggested considerable skill applied to modest materials. Gideon ate and said less than he should have. And watched Evangeline at the other end of the table manage the conversation with the effortless grace of a woman who had learned to fill silences because no one else would. She told him, when he asked, about the tenant farms. She had brought 3 of the 7 into positive arrangements, a 4th was close to agreement. The widow's farm, previously operating at a loss, was now the most productive holding on the estate. She had retained a local carpenter to address the worst of the structural repairs before the autumn rains and had submitted the accounts for Edmund's approval, though Edmund's replies were irregular. She described none of this with pride. She described it the way a competent steward describes an ongoing project, clearly, specifically, without self-congratulation. It was exactly how Gideon himself would have presented such a report, and the recognition of that similarity did something uncomfortable to his composure. You have done well here, he said. I have done what was necessary, she replied. Ashcroft deserved better than what it had. A small, distinct silence. You refer to Edmund's management, he said. I refer to the situation I found, she said. I do not think it useful to assign responsibility for what is past. She looked at him then, steadily and without challenge, but with a directness that communicated, very clearly, that she knew precisely who was responsible for the situation she had found, and that she had chosen not to say so as an act of will rather than ignorance. Gideon felt the measured rebuke of it land somewhere in his chest. 3 days into his visit, a letter arrived from the neighboring estate, Sir Randolph Vane, a man Gideon knew slightly and did not particularly like, who had been quietly purchasing land adjacent to Ashcroft for 2 years. The letter was addressed to Edmund, but Evangeline opened it in Edmund's absence and brought it to Gideon with her own analysis already written on a separate sheet in her clear hand. Vane was making an offer for the 3 southern farms. The offer was fair in isolation but catastrophic in context. Those 3 farms were the primary access to Ashcroft's water rights. And without them the Hall's agricultural capacity would be permanently diminished. He knows Edmund doesn't pay close attention, Gideon said, reading Vane's letter. Yes, Evangeline said. I believe that was the calculation. You have already written a reply. I have drafted one. It requires your signature, as it involves the dukedom's land interests. She placed a second sheet before him. You will find I have been thorough. He read the draft. It was precise, legally sound, and effectively closed every angle Vane had left open. He signed it without amendment, which was the most honest compliment he knew how to offer, and she received it without comment. But their hands brushed as she took the paper back, and neither of them was quite as composed in the following 10 minutes as they had been before. He found her in the kitchen garden at dawn on the 5th morning of his visit. He had not slept well. He rarely did, away from the particular routine of his London rooms. And the old dreams had returned, the ones shaped by cannon fire and mud and the faces of men he could no longer help, and he had risen before light and walked without particular direction until the gray pre-dawn sky had led him, by some mechanism he could not explain, to the south wall of the kitchen garden. She was already there, kneeling in the earth beside the pear espalier, her dark hair loose down her back, her oldest dress worn without apparent self-consciousness. Her bare hands working the soil around the base of the tree with careful, deliberate attention. She did not hear him come. He stood in the gateway for a long moment, watching her work, and something about the image was so quietly powerful, a woman alone in the gray light, tending something she had brought back from ruin, that he did not want to disturb it. But she looked up, as people do when they are watched. She did not scramble to her feet. She sat back on her heels and looked at him with the same direct calm she offered every encounter with him, and said, "You couldn't sleep either." It was not a question. He came and sat on the old stone bench beside the south wall, and for a while they were simply two people in a garden at dawn, and neither of them spoke, and the silence was different. Not the careful silence of dinner conversation. Something else. "My mother planted this tree," he said eventually, without intending to. Evangeline looked at the pear tree. "I wondered," she said. "She died here. At Ashcroft." He paused. "Edmund was very young. I was 10. I believed for a long time that if I had been different in some way, she might have stayed longer." He did not know why he said that. He had not said it to anyone, ever. The words sat in the morning air with a kind of naked helplessness that was entirely foreign to him, and he felt the familiar impulse to retrieve them, to cover them with composure and silence. Evangeline did not offer sympathy. She did not reach for his hand or produce the soft, alarmed expressions of women who did not know how to sit with another person's pain. She looked at the tree for a moment and then she said, quietly, "Children believe that. It isn't true, but they believe it." "No," he said. "I know that now." "Do you?" she said. And she looked at him then, and the question was gentle and genuine and entirely without pity, and he understood that she was not asking about his mother. He had sent her to marry his brother. He had looked at a woman of extraordinary capability and quietly devastating courage, and he had decided, in 30 seconds, that she was insufficient. And she had survived the decision. She had come to this cold, neglected house and she had made it into something warm and real and worthy, and she had done it without bitterness and without waiting for rescue. He sat with that understanding in the morning light and said nothing, because there was nothing yet that he was fit to say. She returned to her work at the pear tree, and he stayed, and the sky lightened around them, and the garden, her garden, came gradually into color. The storm arrived on a Friday evening without the courtesy of much warning. The barometric pressure had been falling since noon. And Evangeline had sent Lily home early and secured the loose glass in the north-facing windows and made sure the stock in the home farm were properly housed. All the small practical measures of a woman who had learned to read weather and act before it acted on her. What she had not anticipated was that one of the tenant families, the Holloways, on the northernmost farm, had an elderly father who lived in a separate cottage that sat in the lowest part of the valley, in precisely the path of any significant flooding. It was young Thomas Perry, Mrs. Perry's nephew, who brought the news at 7 in the evening as the sky was going green and the wind was beginning to make the hall's old bones creak. Old Mr. Holloway was alone in the cottage. His family was sheltering with neighbors on higher ground and believed he had gone with them. He had not. Evangeline was in her cloak and boots before Gideon finished reading Thomas's garbled account. He caught her at the door. "You cannot go alone," he said. "Then come," she said. They went together, Gideon and Thomas and the older groom, with lanterns and the heavy farm cart. The valley lane was already running with water, the hedgerows bending and lashing, the rain so heavy it was more like standing in a river than a storm. Evangeline did not hesitate. She knew the lane, she had walked it 30 times. And she kept her lantern high and her pace deliberate, and she called directions to the groom over the wind with the authority of someone who had already calculated the route. They reached the cottage with 15 minutes to spare, perhaps less. The water was at the doorstep. Old Mr. Holloway was found inside in his chair, entirely composed, with the particular tranquility of a man who has decided his circumstances are in God's hands and cannot be improved by agitation. Getting him into the cart and back up the lane required all four of them and a degree of physical effort that left no room for dignity or conversation. When they finally came through Ashcroft's kitchen door into the lamplight and warmth, with an 80-year-old man wrapped in every spare blanket Mrs. Perry could produce, and the storm screaming at the windows, Gideon looked across the kitchen at Evangeline, muddy, drenched, breathing hard, with a cut on her palm from the gate latch she had not mentioned, and felt something in his chest crack open so completely that he had to look away. She was binding her own hand at the kitchen table, efficiently and without drama, when he crossed the room and sat down beside her and said, "Give me that," and took the cloth from her and finished tying it himself. His hands were steady. Hers were, too. Their heads were very close together in the kitchen lamplight, and the storm was very loud and neither of them spoke, and it was the loudest silence he had ever heard. "Evangeline," he said. Her given name, used without permission, without rank, without the careful architecture of formality. She looked up at him. She did not pull her hand away. "I think," he said, "that I owe you something I do not know how to give." "An apology," she said. "That," he said. "And rather more than that." She considered him for a long moment with those steady dark eyes, and then she said, "I know." And she took her hand back, gently but firmly, and went to see about Mr. Holloway's supper. Edmund arrived from London the following Monday, full of good cheer and charming apologies for his absence, with a new hat and wine from a reputable merchant and absolutely no awareness of the storm, the flooding, the rescue, or the slow seismic shift that had been occurring at Ashcroft in his absence. He embraced Gideon with genuine warmth. He brought Evangeline's hand to his lips with genuine affection. He was, in every particular, exactly as he had always been, kind, careless, comfortable in his own skin. Constitutionally unable to remain anywhere that demanded more of him than pleasant company and occasional charm. Gideon watched his brother move through Ashcroft, this restored, breathing, carefully tended house, and saw that Edmund appreciated none of it in the particular way that it deserved to be appreciated. He enjoyed the warmth without asking where it came from. He ate the good meals without wondering who had made the garden possible. He sat in rooms that had been sealed for 20 years without understanding what it had cost someone to open them. That evening, after Edmund had retired early and the hall had settled into night silence, Gideon went to the library where Evangeline worked late on the estate accounts. She looked up when he entered. She did not put down her pen. He stood in the doorway for a moment and then he said, "I am going to be direct with you, because I have already wasted too much time on the alternative." She set down her pen. She folded her hands. She waited. "When I met you in that drawing room in London," he said, "I looked at you for 30 seconds and made a decision I had no right to make. I told myself it was a practical matter. That you were insufficient. That my duty required a particular kind of alliance and that you could not serve it." He paused. "That was a lie I told myself because I was afraid, and it has cost you 2 years of your life in circumstances that were beneath you in every sense I was responsible for." The room was very quiet. The fire was low. The candle on her desk cast a small warm circle around her face. "I know what I did," he said. "I do not ask you to forgive it. I ask you to understand that when I look at this house now, at what you have built here, at who you are in this place, I understand the full measure of what I turned away from. And it is the most clarifying and most painful understanding I have ever come to." Evangeline was silent for a long moment. Outside, the night was still after the storm, and the garden she had restored lay quiet in the dark. "You were not simply afraid," she said at last. "You were numb. There is a difference, and it matters because one of those things can be recovered from." He looked at her. "I found the letters in the East Wing," she said quietly. "Your mother's letters. The ones she wrote to your father in the last months. I did not read them, I would not presume, but I could see from the dates in the volume of them that she wrote every day, and I understood, I think, something about what that room held for you. Why it was sealed. Why you came back from the war already sealed." He did not speak. He could not, for a moment. "You sent me to marry your brother," she said, "because you decided, without evidence, that connection was something you were no longer capable of. And you were wrong." She rose from her chair and came to stand before him, and her eyes did not waver. "I am not going to tell you that it did not hurt. It did. Deeply. I am not going to pretend that the past 2 years were simple or that I did not lie awake in this cold house and feel the injustice of it." "You would be right to," he said. "I would," she agreed. "But I am also honest enough to say that those 2 years made me something I might not have become otherwise. And I am not entirely certain that I would give them back." She paused. "What I want is acknowledgement, not remedy. I want you to know what you did. And it seems, at last, that you do." I do, Gideon said. And I want, he stopped. He tried again. I would like, if you will allow it, to begin in the place where I should have begun. To know you. As I should have endeavored to know you 2 years ago. I would like to earn what I was too proud and too frightened to deserve when it was first offered. The candle on the desk flickered. Somewhere in the hall above them, the old house settled with a sound like a slow, contented breath. Evangeline looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "There is no version of this that is simple." "No," he agreed. "Edmund will need to be spoken to. Honestly, and with kindness." "Yes. And I will not be managed or decided for again. By anyone." "No," he said. "You will not." She nodded, once, slowly. Then she said, "There is tea on the hob if you would like to sit down." She gestured to the chair beside the fire, not the chair behind the desk, not the formal chair by the door, but the one she had set close to the warmth, and she went to pour the tea with the same unhurried composure with which she did everything. And Gideon Wyndham crossed the library of Ashcroft Hall and sat down beside the fire she had lit, in the house she had saved. And understood for the first time in his adult life what it felt like to have come home. They spoke until after midnight. Not of love, it was too early for that word, and she was too careful and he was too newly honest to deploy it without earning it. They spoke of the estate, and of his time in the peninsula, and of her childhood in Wiltshire, and of the East Wing rooms, and of the pear tree, and of what the Ashcroft tenants needed in the coming year. They spoke as equals, which was something Gideon Wyndham had not done with any person in longer than he could account for. And when she finally rose and said good night and walked quietly out with the candle, he sat alone for a while in the warm darkness of the library and thought that the most extraordinary thing he had yet discovered about Evangeline Ashworth was that she had not needed his rescue, or his title, or his opinion of her. She had only needed, as everyone needs, to be truly seen. He intended to spend the rest of his life making up for how long it had taken him to look properly. The matter of Edmund was handled with care and characteristic goodwill on Edmund's part. He had, it emerged, formed a sincere attachment to a young widow in London and had been wondering for some time how to raise the subject. The legal and social complications were delicate, but they were managed by a family of sufficient position and sufficient discreet solicitors to manage most things. What mattered was that the conversations were honest, and that no one pretended that the original arrangement had been anything other than what it was. On the morning that Gideon prepared to return to London to begin the necessary proceedings, he found Evangeline in the kitchen garden at the pear tree again. The summer was full and green around her. The garden was extraordinary. He stopped at the gate, as he had before. She heard him this time, and she turned, and the morning light fell across her face in a way that made something permanently rearrange itself inside his chest. "I shall return," he said. "As soon as it is properly possible to return." "I know," she said. Not with uncertainty. With the calm of a woman who has learned to trust her own knowledge of things. He nodded. And then, because he had been a man of formality and restraint for 31 years and had lately come to understand the cost of it, he crossed the garden in 4 steps and took her hand and held it. And said, "Evangeline, I was a fool, and I was afraid, and I am more grateful than you will let me tell you yet for the fact that you were strong enough to survive me being both." She looked down at his hand over hers. Then she looked up. And she smiled, not the careful social smile of the drawing room in London, but a small, real, unguarded thing that he had not seen before and that he understood instantly he would spend considerable effort and genuine change of character earning the right to see again. "Go," she said. "And come back quickly." He rode out through the gate that swung clean and quiet on newly hung hinges, and turned once to look back at the hall. At the green garden over the south wall, and the white linen on the line, and the smoke rising from the kitchen fire. And the woman who had made a ruin into a home and had not once allowed anyone to diminish her for it. He had said, in a cold drawing room on a grey November afternoon, "Marry my brother instead." He had been wrong, and foolish, and frightened, and proud. And she had agreed, and she had survived, and she had built something extraordinary from the wreckage of his cowardice. And he had regretted it by morning. He simply hadn't been brave enough, then, to know what to do with the regret. He was learning. Slowly, genuinely, and with the kind of effort that leaves a mark. He turned his horse toward London, and behind him, Ashcroft Hall stood warm and breathing in the summer morning, waiting, as all well-tended things wait, with patience and quiet certainty for what was coming home. And there you have it, a love earned in the hardest way, through pride undone and silence survived, in a woman who refused, in every quiet and extraordinary moment, to be less than she was. If this story moved you, stayed with you, or reminded you of why you love the slow burn of a romance truly felt, please leave a comment below and tell us which moment touched you most. Don't forget to like this episode and share it with someone who deserves a beautiful story today. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another tale of dignity, transformation, and love that arrives, at last, exactly when it is most deserved.